Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Ravi, for having me here. And I must endorse, before I even begin inviting Ambassador Rao to speak, I must endorse what Ravi just said. I think this is an extremely detailed and very nuanced and well-articulated account of what is a very difficult and controversial period in our history. It's a period which has become a source of much friction even in present-day discourse in public, and therefore, in that context, I think this book is a must-read for people who are interested in Indian history and the evolution of India's policy with regard to China and Tibet. The first thing that I experienced when I started reading the book, and I started reading it last week, and reading the first chapter, the first word that came to my head was empathy. And I was telling Ambassador Rao this outside when we were chatting that I think it's not just a very well articulated book in terms of the analysis of policy, in terms of the analysis of the people, in terms of the analysis of the events, but also it's an empathetic and broad view of how things play out in history. From hindsight, history can seem, there are binaries that we draw, and that's evident in our public discourse today. But the people who were at that point of time dealing with the issues that they were dealing with, often history is written with a very blinkered view. This is not that. This is in some ways, it's a fearless critique of how India's policies were, but it's also an empathetic view of why they were the way they were. So I think you pull no punches, but you also, and you do give due credit where due credit is to be given, but you also sort of make the case that we need to have a much more open, broad-based approach to history. With that, Ambassador Rao, I wanted to begin with firstly a question to look at. You've been in the Foreign Service for a very long period of time. You had a very long, distinguished career. Why write about this period? You served as ambassador to China, as ambassador to the United States, in very interesting moments, in very interesting periods, and of course as Foreign Secretary. Why this period and why now?
Thank you, Manoj. Manoj is known as the China dude on social media, and I think he really turned out to be a great dude today for salvaging our event. Thank you so much for doing this. Well, to answer your question, Manoj, why did I choose to write about a period with which I was not directly associated, because I joined the Foreign Service in 1973, and I was just a child when all the events that I have chronicled in this book really took place. I wrote about it because I happened to be the desk officer for China from 1984 to 1992, 8 long years, or a biblical span, you might say. And it was a period in which I kind of was in the trenches, deeply immersed in the study of this subject. And I happened to look at the historical records. I happened to meet a lot of the people associated with this period. And it was also the time that Sumdarongchu happened. We had the confrontation in Wangdung with the Chinese in Arunachal Pradesh, in the Tawang district. Very different atmosphere, of course, from today's confrontation over Galwan. So it was a period when you not only had to understand the history that had gone before, in order to get into the years of normalization that were taking place from 1976 onwards, even before I had come to do this work. And I got so, not just involved, deeply interested in this period. And it also came to me as a realization that all that happened during this period continues to impact and influence and have a say, really, in what we do with China, even unto this day when we are in the 2020s, in the roaring, I'm not sure if they're roaring, but roaring 20s, I'll say, of this century. So I felt it was an obligation. I looked on it. I think we women are brought up with obligations. So I felt it was my obligation to be able to enlighten in the best way possible a younger generation about the eventful circumstances of this period between 1949 and 1962, a 13-year period in which, in many ways, I think the world was formed as far as the India-China relationship was concerned. We came to encounter each other soon after we became independent nations. It was a period of sort of a certain effervescence in the relationship, discovering each other, talking about friendship, cementing ties that essentially had not existed, although we talk of a millennial relationship. That was thousands of years ago, and there had been a huge interregnum in which we were not really interacting with each other, except through Tibet. And that's why I call the India-China relationship a three-body problem. Tibet is very much involved in this. The border we share with China is essentially a border with the Xinjiang Autonomous Region and the Tibet Autonomous Region. And I felt I needed to tell the story of the Tibetans also. So that's the kind of background. Just sort of an inspiration I've got during those years when I worked on the subject. And then all the archives had opened up, a lot of the archives, not every bit of it, but enough for me to write, I felt.
No, I think that's one of the interesting things about the book, that it's you bring a practitioner's view to things, but you also bring a historical lens to it, and you bring archives, and you also bring views from different analysts who've looked at the events as they were happening, which I think is really, really interesting. But before I get into sort of details of the book, I want to sort of talk to you a little bit about the writing process. What does it take to actually process this amount of material? Firstly, how long did it take you to write the book? What was your process like to actually go through all this material, make sense of it, put the dots together, and then piece together a picture which is so beautifully put together?
Well, first of all, as I'd been a practitioner and I knew the sequence of events and I knew a lot of the personalities involved and what to focus on. And that's where I think being a practitioner made a difference, because you bring that lens to bear on the story. And from your point of view, professionally, what I felt was important, what was vital to the understanding of the story, I felt I needed to focus on. But then the challenge arose of how was I to meld that professional experience. I couldn't obviously say, I wasn't actually there when it all happened, so I couldn't really claim I knew these things. I mean, you could turn around and ask me, how do I know these things? And I certainly could not cite records that were still closed or classified, because that would have been against the law. So I had to wait to study the archives, whatever was open, whatever had been written about the story, and then use my practitioner's lens to focus and highlight certain aspects of it. So that's how I approached the whole process of writing. How long did I take to write it? I began the research on the book in 2014. That's 7 long years ago. And that's the year I interviewed His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala and started my work while I was at Brown University. And I also had received the Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship for 2014-15, actually. For 2 years, I had the fellowship. And that helped me a lot to come here and work at the Nehru Memorial Library, look at the Nehru papers. And so that's how it all began. And I consolidated all this research by about 2017. I had most of the material, had to add on a little more subsequently, and started the process of writing in 2017. So it's taken 4 years. And if it hadn't been for the lockdown, I might have still been writing it, because I think that enforced a sense of discipline, and you had to sit down in front of your computer and finish it. So I think about 9 chapters of the book were finished during lockdown. So until then, I had just done about 6 or 7. So
I think that's a phenomenal sort of arc of, and I think it shows in the book. It shows in the book that you've sort of pulled through a lot of different threads and try to connect them. And I mean, that's not something that one can do in a very short span of time. So I think that shows in the book. I won't sort of get into questions of current day policy, because I presume that by the time we come to you, you will have these questions of current day policy. So I'm going to sort of first begin with the beginning. 1947, India becomes independent. Jawaharlal Nehru becomes the prime minister. 2 years later, China is still in sort of a state of flux. There's a civil war going on. 2 years later, you see the PRC taking shape. What is the sort of... there's this constant thing about... There's a different worldview. Despite both countries having not shared, but an experience of colonialism, there's a very different lesson that each draws and each leadership draws. I wanted to sort of talk to us about that perception and how that played a role in how this relationship involved, and also of the personalities involved from... let's just begin with Nehru and Mao, and then we'll go to the rest of them.
Well, I think our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was essentially a product of India's freedom movement and an exposure to the Western Enlightenment, the ideas that he had absorbed during his education in the UK, and his close association with his mentor, really, Mahatma Gandhi. And all that marked our freedom struggle for its non-violence, civil disobedience, what Anthony Kennedy calls the moral efficacy of India's approach to gaining freedom from colonial rule. It was, quite unique and spectacular, I believe, by all world standards. By way of contrast, the Chinese approach to their liberation, as they called it, especially the approach of the Chinese Communist Party, because as you remember, from 1911 onwards, from the time that the Qings were unseated by Yuan Shikai, since then, and then the emergence of the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, and then, of course, the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s, there was this whole urge expressed by the Chinese people, despite whatever party they belonged to or whatever their allegiance was to any ideology, that China should shake off the shackles of foreign domination, that China should never experience humiliation, as they called it, of the sort that the foreigners had imposed on them, and that the reason why China was so backward and so behind the rest of the West, as it were, was because they had not embraced modern ideas, they had not understood the concept of modernity, of science, of development. So that was, behind, as you know, the May 4th, 1919 movement of the students in China. So very different kind of, the embrace, the willing suspension of disbelief when it came to Western ideas or especially relating to science and material progress. China is a material culture, as you know. And therefore, that was one aspect of it. The second aspect, of course, was the whole approach to seeking freedom from foreign domination through violent means, if it so necessitated. So it was a very martial kind of approach. So you contrast the moral efficacy of the Indian freedom movement and the martial efficacy, as again, Anthony Kennedy's term, of the Chinese approach to liberation. So there again, you find the leadership in both these movements very different. I talked of Nehru, the idealist, the visionary, the romantic, who, as his biographer S. Gopal said, pitched his tent in the terrain of the Spanish Civil War. Things like that. He was so enthused about all this and inspired by it also. He was very inspirational, his approach. But in the case of Mao and Zhou Enlai, I think they were leaders really born on the anvil of a very violent revolution, guerrilla warfare, stealth, strategic planning to overcome the enemy, first the Japanese and then the Kuomintang. So you had two sets of leaders, ours and theirs, who came from very different experiences, who were the products of two very different movements. Although China and India emerged on the Asian stage, on the global stage, almost simultaneously, two big, large Asian countries with a lot of potential to lead the world and to lead Asia and to express this newfound spirit of freedom as a result of this struggle.
Well, is there a difference, was there a difference in how the Communist Party saw India and its relationship with India, and not just the bilateral relationship in terms of the political relationship, but also the civilizational sort of, in some ways, a hierarchical view of civilization in terms of how the Communist Party saw India and how the Kuomintang leadership saw India? Because at one point of time, you talk about even Chiang Kai-shek's view of India, and it's not very flattering.
No.
So is that something to do with a historical legacy, or was that something that developed over time because of the sense of among these nationalists? Because in some ways, even the Communist Party was yes, it was ideologically communist, but it's also nationalism was also a key prong of it, is still a key prong of it. Is that nationalism a product of the sort of post-1911 thing that they sort of developed? Or is there a sort of deeper civilizational sense of hierarchy within this region, and China and our sort of civilization ranks higher? Because that's the sense that you sort of get.
Well, I think that is inherent in the Chinese approach to India, and it's not just something that has to do with Xi Jinping's China today, but it really dates back to the time I write about and even before. I think there was this feeling, although if you read about Rabindranath Tagore's visit to China in the 1920s. A lot of his Chinese interlocutors called India the elder brother and China the younger brother. But I think that was just in passing. I don't believe that was the lasting attitude that the Chinese had towards the Indians. Yeah. And I think China, second point was, China always had it in her mind that China should emerge as the number one power in the world, that China it was sort of like the Americans speak of manifest destiny. I think this was China's sense of manifest destiny, that it was destined to lead and be among, the top global powers, even at that time when it had just struggled through the Civil War. And there was a sense of intense competition, perhaps not so articulated, with India. Yeah. I mean, if good things happened to India, I don't think they were really open-minded about such good things happening to us. And they wanted success for themselves. And in a sense, it was a very opportunistic attitude to India on the part of leaders like Zhou Enlai, when this so-called friendship with Nehru and with India helped China gain a foothold on the global stage, as it were. China, India, in fact, became a facilitator of China's entry onto the global stage. And Nehru wanted that. Nehru felt that India and China should work together, that India should help in China articulate its interests and its aims and its goals in a way that the rest of the world could understand. Because as you said, he didn't really regard the Chinese as just communists. Yeah. He regarded them as being capable of exerting an independent force in world politics.
So I want to stick with Nehru, and you spoke about his idealism. Throughout the book, at different points of time, even before the PRC comes into being, you see that there are markers where you can see friction, you can see the perception from the Chinese leadership being one essentially driven from that relationships, international relations, are essentially a function of power primarily. Yeah. Whereas you see in the Indian approach, it's not a negation of the centrality of power, but it's also a case that power at the end of the day has to lead to a common good, which is a certain notion of peace. And Nehru is driven by that. And driven to the point where there are lots of markers where if you see, for instance, a conversation that you quote between Nehru and Mao, and it's a discussion on war and the purpose of war and the nature of war and the inevitability of war. And you can quite evidently see that there is a very different approach to each of them. You can also see that at different points of time when Indian and Chinese officials are talking, the Chinese are talking about specific sources of discontent, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Tibet, whether it's these so-called unequal treaties, whereas India is essentially talking about, well, look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that you and us in Asia and a different dynamic. Was that essentially a leader-driven worldview in India? Or was that a product of also a systemic approach to that this is where the world needs to go? A sort of, again, a sense of destiny, that this is where the world needs to go, otherwise it's fundamentally problematic. And this is India's role in the world, that we need to be fashioning this peace.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think Nehru was definitely driven by that kind of worldview. I'm not sure if the rest of his cabinet or his political colleagues were driven by that kind of worldview. I don't even know if they had much of a worldview at that time. They had all emerged out of the freedom movement. There were challenges of national consolidation. And I think there was a kind of a very reductive view, let me say, or essentialist view of good and bad, who are our enemies. The communists are our enemies. India as a democracy should align itself much more closely with the West. I mean, there were views of that sort that were expressed, but not any fully formed worldview. I think to that extent, to give Nehru credit, he did have that kind of closely held belief about the unity of man and the need to work together for peace. He abhorred war. He was apprehensive of a nuclear conflict and wanted total disarmament. And he thought India and China could work together as that third force in world politics. On the other hand, as you said, the Chinese were intent on advancing their own interests in Asia, and they were involved with the Korean War, of course, and that took up a lot of their time and resources in those early years. And they were waiting and watching. I think it was more diplomacy by stealth. And in fact, Gopal uses the word delusional diplomacy as far as India was concerned. Maybe I would say it was more diplomacy driven by this belief, this idealism, this feeling that we would not be part of East or West, and that China could be one of our fellow travelers in that journey that we were moving forward on to create that kind of a world order.
It's also clear that at different points of time, Nehru does question himself also.
Yes.
It's not a case that he's woolly-headed and he's so, he's so lost in that mentality. He does question himself. He does, at certain points of time, there is a conversation about border posts and making sure there's a detailed back and forth about the 1954 agreement and how we should be. And again, there are so many other factors that drive the decision-making towards that agreement. I'll get to that agreement, and I want to sort of have a quick conversation about that because that's been the source of much consternation.
That's right.
In terms of the bureaucracy, so you have a leader who is predisposed to a certain view and who has a certain agenda which is broader than just a sort of just limited to national interest in that sense. How does a sort of bureaucracy work in that? Because there are different points of time where you see that there are different actors, whether it is Mr. Bajpayee, whether it is the Ambassador Panikkar, whether it is Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. You can see all these characters influencing policy making, but also having this animated discussion about what should be the case. And you can see that there is a confirmation bias that I think Nehru keeps picking up on at different points of time. So again, as somebody who's been in the foreign service, who's been a career diplomat, how do ambassadors, when you look back at history and when you look back at present day, how do ambassadors sort of approach this sort of, it's quite tricky, right? They're supposed to respond to the leadership. The leadership has an agenda, yet you may be observing certain things, but you also have your own instincts and inclinations. How well did some of the ambassadors at this period serve Indian interests? And how does that sort of dynamic between the bureaucracy play out?
Well, I've said somewhere in the book that Nehru was neither Kissinger nor Bismarck. I think to use what Jagat Mehta said in his memoirs, he was more like a Caesar, I believe, and everybody was beholden to their Caesar. And the bureaucracy particularly didn't really take issue with anything he had to say or whatever policy decisions he decided to move forward with. So I think if there was a shortcoming, perhaps it was that, and a lot of lessons are to be learned from that. I think it is very much a part of the Oriental tradition that you look up to your superiors, and the power distances are so large, as you know, in our society. So I'm not sure if that has entirely changed today, but then you learn from the experience, like you learn from the experience of these 13 years, what could have been done, what decisions were haphazard, what were ad hoc, what could have been done differently. So that accretion of knowledge, that accumulation of experience then serves you in your decision making later, because even the leadership is aware of it, and even you as part of the bureaucratic institution is aware of it. So in that sense, learning from history is a good thing.
Yeah. And you make that point very well in the beginning where you say that history need not burden current policy, but it can provide a ballast for current policy. Okay, we've spoken about the different characters and their motivations, and we've spoken a little bit about the environment within which India and the PRC emerge. What are the sort of, and you do this quite well, you articulate quite well the different pressures and the different sort of points of action that are in the mind of the policymaker at that point of time when you're making this decision. And often when we read history about India and China, particularly this period, it's a very blinkered approach where you're not looking at the 20,000 other things that are happening in the world at the same time and that may be commanding the policymakers' attention. At different points of time here, say when it comes to the 1954 agreement on Tibet, there is a conversation internationally going on. There's a conference in Geneva. There is concern in India about consolidation of the Indian Union. And the impact that it will have on all of that. So I want you to sort of take us through the mind of Nehru or the Indian policymaker at that point of time, at that position. What are the kind of pressures when you're looking at negotiating this relationship? And in your sort of your appreciation of how well do you think they managed those multiple pressures?
Yeah. Well, I think they managed as best as they could. And I'm not one of those, and I know there's a whole industry that has grown up today about blame Nehru. You remember that famous song, Blame Canada? It's like that, blame Nehru. But I really don't subscribe to that constituency, especially since you learn from the history of the era. Well, India through that period, it was a young nation in formation. I think nationhood was still being consolidated. The kind of challenges that we faced just within our borders, I'm not talking of beyond our borders, I'm not talking of Pakistan or what happened with Kashmir, or for that matter, what was going to happen with China. I mean, just the process of consolidation, consolidating the union of states, the union of India, as it were, bringing unity out of this diversity, really, literally. And that was all part of the challenge that Nehru and our leaders at that time faced. So, while you're talking about the formation of China policy, you must understand that everything has to be taken and understood in context. There are no absolute truths here. I mean, you can't just say Nehru did this wrong or Nehru can be faulted for this. I think, yes, he was flawed in many ways, but flawed in a heroic sense, I say, because he truly was dedicated to the nation's cause. I don't think anybody can doubt his patriotism and his dedication to India. So you must understand the context in which we were placed at that time. All of us have grown up in a different India. We are children of you're much younger, but I'm also a child of a different generation. But that post-independence generation, what it went through, I think was very different from what we experience today. And then secondly, having gone through this process of throwing off the shackles of foreign domination through our freedom struggle, I think Nehru was against imperialist legacies of all sort. And I think he approached the whole issue of Tibet also from that angle. And, the Tibet agreement, which, of course, you wanted to discuss separately, I think was also, we got into that process of addressing the whole question of the rights and privileges that we had inherited through Britain as a successor state on Tibet, also from that angle. We can discuss this further. But I think that issue of, the leftovers of imperial legacy should be done away with was also very strongly embedded in Nehru's approach. And of course, I think he took a realist attitude on the whole issue because I think he knew and everybody knew. In fact, General Cariappa had advised him once the Chinese had entered Tibet that at the most we could provide a battalion, perhaps to defend our interest in Yatung. We could do nothing about the entry of the Chinese People's Liberation Army into Tibet. There's a whole lot of people here who said, we gave up Tibet. Was Tibet ours to give up in the first place? It was never ours to give up. It was never a part of our territory. Yes, in a sense, our sacred geography always included Tibet because of the ties, literally the osmosis that had taken place between Tibet and India culturally, the pilgrimage ties, the trade ties. But, it was not part of any Indian territory at any point of time. So there was no question of giving up Tibet. So I think he took a realist view, and at the same time, he understood the need to consolidate our frontiers. It was way back in 1950 that he said the McMahon line is our boundary, map or no map, his famous quote, So that's the context in which we were placed. And I also recall There's a lot of debate about what Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel said and what Nehru said and the differences. But, my book tries to bring out the extraordinary empathy that existed between these two men. And Lord Mountbatten speaks a lot about it, and I've referred to it in my book. And also, I quote from Gulzarilal Nanda when he said, perhaps where where Pandit Nehru was concerned, I think he, in a sense, was focused on the need for progress, for development, all the things that he felt would make India great and India a leading country. And Sardar Patel was focused on the need of the people for security, for safety. And I think that resonates a great deal even today in our people. I think there are lessons to be learned. But the fact is that even if it was a team of rivals, to use Abraham Lincoln's phrase, at the same time, they'd learned to work together. They'd learned to listen to each other. And they really took Gandhi's advice that they needed to work together and cooperate very, very seriously.
I think that's a fascinating thing, because that's a dynamic that even today plays out in politics, where even if it's not oppositional politics, it's in government, I'm sure that this dynamic plays out in terms of security and development, and where should our budgets go, who should be getting what, given the environment that we live in. And they did sort of, like you bring this out really, really well, that the dichotomy between the two, but also their ability to work together, and their ability to defer to each other's views at the end of the day, to disagree without being disagreeable. I think that's something that's remiss in our politics today also. I wanted to get to Tibet, because that's the third body in this three-body problem. And like you said, that Tibet was never India's in that sense. It was never a part of India, and there was never a discussion about India, Tibet being sort of sovereign territory of India. But there was a discussion about, like you said, India's privileges in Tibet, which we had inherited. And it wasn't necessarily, India wasn't sanguine about giving up every privilege that it inherited, for example, and all the legacies of the Raj were not given up. And that's one of the qualms that the Chinese had through those decades, and even today, in their discourse, they portray India, when they feel like it, as an imperial inheritor, and that continues till today. Yet on Tibet, the argument is not necessarily that we shouldn't have necessarily negotiated those things away. And you make this case also. We gave them away without a bargain. There is a notion of, yes, we need to, you come from this idealistic logic of, yes, these are inheritances of colonialism and imperialism, and we are willing to sort of give them away. But yet in diplomacy, these are cards that you hold. And the criticism of that agreement in 1954 was that it gave away a lot more without India's really getting anything in return. And part of that, and this to me mystifies me even today, is our desire not to approach the boundary question. The Chinese didn't want to. And like you said, they like Zhou Enlai said, we will talk about things that are ripe for settlement.
Exactly.
And they didn't see the boundary issue as ripe for settlement. Yet we went in assuming, the Indian officials at that point in time went in assuming that if there is silence, it is acceptance.
Yes.
I want to sort of get to that, your sort of view on that, because you're critical of that. While you acknowledge the fact that this was the perspective that we came from with regard to these privileges, but you're still very critical of that. And I wanted to sort of get a little bit of that. What do you think we could have achieved in that scenario?
Okay. First and foremost, I think this obsession with imperialist privilege, in fact, dates back to I was just reading about Congress meeting, a plenary meeting held in 1904, soon after the Young Husband expedition, which was very critical about the British moves into Tibet. So this was a kind of legacy that Nehru was dealing with also. I have to put that on record. Now, what did we give away without really getting a good bargain for ourselves is your question. So you had 1954. You had the Chinese, prior to that, you had the Chinese entry into Tibet. you had signals and indications from the Chinese that, these matters about India's presence in Tibet, we had these trade agencies, we had these military escorts, we had these posts and telegraph offices, all that we had inherited from the British as a successor state. So the Chinese obviously wanted to renegotiate that. They wanted the political office in Lhasa to become a consulate general, which it became in 1952, even before the agreement, the Tibet agreement. So when we came around to discussing the agreement, which is popularly known as the Panchsheel Agreement today because it encapsulated the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in its preamble. It was the first agreement signed in Hindi, apart from Chinese and English. That's another little trivia. But the fact is that I think what we neglected perhaps to focus on in more depth, despite the advice from Sir Girija Shankar Bajpai, who was at that time governor of Bombay. He had retired as Secretary General of the Ministry of External Affairs. And he really emerges as some kind of a, oracular kind of presence. He sort of foretold a lot of things, I think, that could have gone wrong in the relationship. So he advised Nehru that we should also discuss the question of the border with the Chinese, simultaneous to the discussion of the question of our rights and privileges in Tibet. And he was, in a sense, overruled, in Nehru's mind, by the advice from Sardar Panikkar, who by that time, mind you, was not our ambassador in China. He was ambassador in Egypt, in Cairo. But Nehru was obviously consulting him also. So Nehru, although his instincts told him that we should not leave the border unattended or not discussed at this juncture, that this may be a suitable juncture, he somehow despite those instincts, decided to go along with Sardar Panikkar's advice, and we didn't raise the question of the boundary, on the assumption that the Chinese had not raised it with us so far, that we can proceed on the lines that this is not going to be a problem. Whereas now we know from the Chinese archives that are now open that the Chinese were also aware of this problem relating to the McMahon line, which they did not accept, which they thought as an imperialist legacy. But they needed a little more time internally to study the problem and then come up with what could be a possible approach to the issue. So they had also taken a decision internally, which we were not aware of, that they would not raise the question of the boundary. Not because, there was no problem with it, but because they knew there was a problem with it. And being Chinese, and always very cautious about the way they proceed on such matters, decided that they would study this more deeply and then raise it at a suitable time. And that's the genesis of Chou En-lai's statement that we are raising questions that are only ripe for settlement. We assumed, and that's where I think diplomacy can never, one lesson to be learned from this, can never proceed on the basis of guesswork. You have to read between the lines and you have to understand what could go wrong and what all this could imply. And that's a lesson, a major lesson to be learned from the 1954 negotiations, where we decided to give up rights and privileges in Tibet, which were tied to the 1914 Simla Convention, in essence. And the boundary between Arunachal Pradesh, what is today Arunachal Pradesh and was then the Northeast Frontier Agency, and Tibet, was also determined during that, in a sense, decided between India and Tibet, during the Simla deliberations of 1914. So on the one hand, you discussed a part of the agreement, you gave up whatever you felt you need to give up, but you left this other aspect, which was also deeply connected with that Simla negotiation, unattended to, assuming that this would never be a problem, that the Chinese essentially accepted it. And then a few months later, Nehru takes the decision that the lines, the boundary lines shown, the international boundary shown with China on our maps, should now be shown as a boundary defined. Yeah. Now, boundaries can be defined not unilaterally, as we all know, in international statecraft. They have to be signed, sealed, and literally delivered on the basis of bilateral agreements. We didn't have that with China. But we assumed that the Chinese would not dispute it.
I wanted to keep the map question as the last question, but since you've brought it right now, I want to ask here. The issuance of maps, and that creates, it not only sends a message to the Chinese and the rest of the world, but it also sends a message domestically. It creates an imagination in your own head of where your country is and what are the boundaries of your country, what are the boundaries of what you... So today, if somebody tells me the name India, I have a very distinct imagination of the boundaries. I've never been to most of those places, but I have a very distinct imagination of those boundaries and a distinct sense of belonging and ownership. And that makes sort of negotiation very, very difficult. So in that context, was the issuance of that map, was that a fundamental error, knowing that you are going to eventually have to have some sort of a negotiation? Because like you said, the Chinese may have not said anything today, but they will certainly say something tomorrow. Was that, and how much of that is an issue today too? Because we have such a strong sense of, perception of our own boundaries. How difficult does that make negotiation?
That's a very important question. If you look at the insignia or what shall I call it, the definition of the Survey of India, it says Our Setu Himachalam. So the Setu being the Ram Setu and the links we have with Sri Lanka and the Pork Strait towards the high Himalaya. That's the definition of India. Or you think of Mother India with her tresses flowing across the Himalayas and standing with her feet in the peninsula and rising up to the mountains. That is the geo-body, as they call it in our imagination, and it's very difficult for us to shed that image and that feeling that we feel about our country and all the emotions that are aroused as a result. But the fact is that in 1954, if we had raised the question of the boundary, and even if the Chinese had turned around and said, this is not a settled question. We didn't probe them. If we had probed them and said, we want to talk about this because this is also connected with the issues we are discussing, and the Chinese had turned around and said, we are not ready as yet. Let us postpone this for now. We will take it up later. We would have known at that time that there is an element of uncertainty or something unsettled about this whole question of the boundary we share with China. Even if we have our views, and as we said, McMahon line is our boundary map or no map, even if we had those views, we would have come to realize that this is going to be a problem in the relationship. It's all very well to talk about Panchsheel and peaceful coexistence and Hindi, Chini, bye-bye, friendship of 1 billion. The fact is that this boundary is not settled, and this is a diplomatic priority that we should pay attention to, because we have our problems already with Pakistan over Kashmir. So do you want a two-front problem? All these things could have been considered at that time. And Nehru perhaps would not have taken that decision also to show our boundary as defined. And even if he had, he would have done it, I think, with due weightage and due thought and consideration that at some point this would have to be discussed with China, and the lines that emerge may not exactly conform to the lines that you show on your map. So all that, I think, was swept aside, and in a very categorical, essentialist way, we said, this is our boundary. The Chinese are not going to raise it with us. It's not really a problem. So guesswork doesn't make for good diplomacy.
And I think, like you said, the quote of Girija Shankar Bajpai, where he said that if we had done that, we would have been sadder men, but at least we would have been wiser men. And I think that captures that really, really well. I have two more questions before I come to the audience. The first is, and these are very broad sweeps because there's so much more to cover. The first is about Tibet. The Tibetan administration there was a sense of dread and there was a sense of anticipation of things changing once the PRC was established. And there was an attempt to try and seek out to see whether you can be recognized as an independent sovereign state, or whether you can reserve your sort of autonomy in some way. And there was a lot of effort that went into that direction, although there could have been so much more that even the Tibetan administration could have done. I want to sort of understand the perspective of the Tibetan administration looking at India and China. Because at times there is a sense that there is a deep expectation from India. There is also deep disappointment from India. Yet India is the only recourse at the end of the day, because nobody else, not the British, not the Americans essentially, are willing to take the lead on this. The Americans specifically say that we will take India's lead, and India needs to take the lead. For the Tibetan administration, particularly the first time when the PLA starts to enter in late 1950, and then in 1951 you formalize the agreement with the Tibetans. There was talk also that the Dalai Lama potentially sort of seeking asylum in India. What were the sort of motivations of the Tibetan administration? Was it a desire to sort of remain independent if they could? And if not, could India have seriously considered the option of giving asylum to the Dalai Lama at that point of time? Would that have been a much more stronger statement? Would that have probably improved our hand in that sense?
Yes, to paraphrase Sir Girija, I think we would have been sadder but wiser if we had done that. The Chinese enter Tibet in the winter of 1950, and by 1951, they are in Lhasa. And they signed the 17-point agreement with the Tibetan administration, Kashag, with representatives like Napo, Nawang, Jigme, who was essentially, I think, commandeered by the Chinese at Chamdo and taken to Beijing and then made to sign the agreement. And that's another tragedy, I think, because Napo was one of the more brilliant, astute Tibetan strategists. Unfortunately, he went over to the other side. So at that point, the Dalai Lama, who is all of 16, I think, at that 15, I think, all of 15, he leaves Lhasa and he comes to Yatung, Dromo, as it's called in Tibetan, in the Chumbi Valley, with the intent of not being in Lhasa at that time and also contemplating what his future is going to be. And I think there was a desire at that time among the Tibetans and the people close to the Dalai Lama that he should leave Tibet and seek asylum elsewhere. I don't think India was specifically seen as a country of asylum, but obviously they were looking to support from India. And that support did not come. I think the decision taken in Delhi was that there was nothing we could do about the Chinese entry into Tibet. There were some who believed that the theocratic order in Tibet was antediluvian and that it had to go and you need to have a more modern setup. So all these approaches were in circulation at that time. Unfortunately for the Dalai Lama, there was no help coming from India. And as you said, the UK and the US were looking to India to take the lead. Although the US was very keen on offering asylum, facilitating asylum. But mind you, even they did not want, we have provided asylum to the Dalai Lama since March 1959. And that's 62 years now. 62, it's a long time. As he says, he counts himself to be the longest staying guest that India has had. And he eats dal chawal now. He's become Indian, he says. So he's here, he's waiting, he's 15 years old, he's waiting for that decision. And the US says, we can provide asylum, but you will have to pay for your stay in the US with your treasure, because they felt the Tibetans had that kind of wherewithal. So you see the approach from, India has completely taken care of the Dalai Lama, and rightfully so. He deserves it in every way. So he didn't get that kind of support. He stays in Yatung. And finally, after the 17-point agreement is signed with the Chinese, he goes back to Lhasa. So similarly, in 1956, he comes here for the 2,500th celebrations of the birth of the Buddha. He comes here as a guest of the government of India, and by that time, trouble is brewing in Tibet, and he wants to stay. And Nehru advises him to go back, and Chou En-lai also pressures. Mao sends Chou En-lai to India to pressure. In his very silken way, he pressurizes Dalai Lama to go back, and then again the Dalai Lama returns to Tibet. Yeah. So that's also a sad chapter in this story. And then finally in 1959, when the revolt in Tibet and his own physical safety becomes an issue in Lhasa, he leaves Lhasa, not with the direct intention of coming to India, but escaping to the southern part of Tibet. And then he crosses over into Arunachal, into the Tawang district, because there was no other alternative, and we gave him that asylum. Throughout this, mind you, the attitude of the Tibetans to Nehru was one of great respect. Yeah. I don't believe, Dalai Lama told me when I interviewed him in 2014 of his first meeting with Panditji in 1954, when the Prime Minister was visiting Beijing for the first time in October 1954. And they meet at this dinner party that Zhou Enlai has thrown for the visiting Indian leader. And the Dalai Lama is in Beijing at that time, and he is invited to the dinner, and he's introduced to Nehru by Zhou Enlai, and how Nehru goes completely silent for a few minutes because he's overcome with emotion. He doesn't know what to say, because I'm sure in Nehru's mind he would have understood that a whole dispensation in Tibet had gone, and that identity, that religious identity that was represented by the Dalai Lama was obviously threatened. So he talks about, and he spoke about Prime Minister Nehru with a lot of affection. In fact, Nehru was considered a Dharma Raja by the Tibetans, a kind of king of religion, as it were, king of the faith. And so that affection never went away, but we were not able to help Tibet. We didn't support the resolution in the United Nations in 1950, 51. We didn't support it in 1959, even after the revolt in Tibet. So in that sense, Tibet was not served by a country that really it had looked up to for millennia. That is also one of the gaps in our story, as it were. Could it have been different? But let's say if India had supported the Tibetans, what would have happened? We would have immediately gone into a relationship of confrontation with the Chinese. Without the material wherewithal to resist them, we would have needed, help from the Americans and the British. The Americans and the allied countries, the NATO countries, were already involved in Korea. I mean, I don't think they were completely preoccupied. They would have had no energy or resources to expend on Tibet. So we would have been left literally holding the baby. And to what extent could a young nation just consolidating itself have been able to do very much to help the Tibetans? So I think the circumstances in those days were really, really difficult for both sides. So I wouldn't, just pin the blame on India totally. I think you have to look at it from all angles, and have a wide-angled perspective of all that happened, and understand that there were very tragic happenings, and the question of Tibetan identity being erased in that manner by China is really something that was extremely sad.
My last question to you before I go to the audience, and I'm going to sort of fast-track myself too. So we've come to 1959. The sort of march for the last 4 years, from 58 onwards till 1962, there is a certain, if not, I wouldn't, maybe an oversight with regard to our approach to Aksai Chin. And there was clear indication that the Chinese were concerned about that part of the world, even in 1954 when we were negotiating that agreement. And Indian diplomats talk about it. So it's not like the Indian diplomats were not aware and India was not aware. Yet there is a certain inability to commit resources for various reasons, of course. By the time we are heading up to 1962, India and China are talking. It's not like we are not talking. There's a meeting happening between Nehru and Zhou Enlai. Yet it seems like the sort of die is cast. You're gradually moving towards confrontation. As a counterfactual, could something different have been done so that we didn't end up in that conflict? Would a greater commitment would that be diplomacy, or would that be a greater commitment of resources on the boundary? Because we did commit resources, the forward policy was there. But would that be a greater commitment of resources to the boundary which would have deterred the Chinese? Or were sort of events moving in their own motion and had become extremely difficult to contain them?
Well, first of all, I think we deterred the Chinese, at least in one sector of the boundary. And I'm talking of the northeastern part, the eastern sector. The India-China boundary, for those who are new to the subject, has the western sector, which is the Ladakh, Xinjiang, Tibet border. You have the middle sector, which is the Himachal-Uttarakhand border with Tibet. You have the Sikkim sector, which is Sikkim's border with Tibet, and you have the eastern sector, which is the border of Arunachal Pradesh with Tibet. And that border is essentially what historically was called the McMahon Line, which dates back to 1914. Now, in the eastern sector, that is the Arunachal Pradesh-Tibet border, we did consolidate our presence. And we owe it to Nehru for having enabled that from 1951 onwards. So this area of the border, which is well endowed in terms of forest resources, in terms of water, in terms of population, settled population, religious and cultural traditions, a very, very rich textured history that those tribal areas have, was completely within the reach of Indian administration from the early 50s onwards. In the middle sector, Uttarakhand, Himachal, already there was a lot of trade happening between the Tibet areas and our border areas. It was a frontier zone in many ways. And that's where pilgrimages to Kailash and Mansarovar, for instance, happen through this middle sector. Even today, I've taken the pilgrimage. You go to Pithoraghar, and then you trek, up to Lipulek Pass, and then cross into Tibet. So that was the route taken by pilgrims, and was also a channel of trade and communication between India and Tibet. It's only in the Ladakh region, in the Aksai Chin, which is essentially a high altitude plateau that does not sustain population or settlement, where the dispute actually arose. As you said, the intelligence about the building of the highway by the Chinese in this area was patchy. Let's put it that way, diplomatically. And we didn't act on many of those reports, even if some of them were media reports. But our trade agent in Gartok, I mentioned him, Lakshman Singh Jangpangi, he's part of our cast of characters. He had sent reports from 1955 onwards about the existence of the highway, or the building of the highway. So once Nehru takes this decision after 1954 to show our map boundary lines as defined and part of Indian territory, Aksai Chin fell within Indian territory. But we had not consolidated a presence there. And let me be frank, let me be honest. Even today, it's difficult to maintain a presence there. Look at the winters that our troops are facing today in Ladakh. Minus 40 degrees centigrade. Are you thinking of establishing villages in the Aksai Chin? No way. You won't be able to do that. You'll have to have regular border patrols, reconnaissance, right up to the border as shown on our maps. And that would have been a momentous challenge, even today, but then you can just imagine. And that had not been done, and you discover the highway. And then, the news breaks. Nehru talks about it in Parliament. You start, exchanging diplomatic notes with China, protest notes, the temperature rises. And Parliament, once it's informed, says, the Chinese have transgressed into our territory. What are you doing about it? Nehru takes a decision to release the white papers on the India-China diplomatic exchanges from 1950 onwards. So everything is out there in the amphitheater. So then diplomacy is conducted by the amphitheater. It's from the galleries that, the opposition charges Nehru for not defending the national interest. Nehru is cornered, and he had himself taken a line that borders should be protected, that we should not prevent we should prevent ingress and aggression from anybody across the border. So I think a number of factors coalesced, came together, and created that climate of opposition within India to being seen as giving in to the Chinese. I refer to what some writers call the reputational imperative. The reputational imperative that you as a leader cannot be seen as giving in to another country when it, violates your sovereignty. Yeah. And both India and China, another analysis says, we both had a sense of victimhood, that we had been victims of imperialism, that we were not going to be giving up territory, that we would not become victims again, we would defend. So there were a number of psychological and military, strategic and diplomatic factors, I think, that combined. Nehru assumed that the Chinese would never attack. I think whatever the differences with China were, there would never be military conflict. I think that perhaps was an assessment that was completely proven wrong, as events showed. Although it's called forward policy by a lot of people, that, we decided to set up posts in territory that was claimed by China in the Aksai Chin, so as to prevent a shift of the Chinese claim line, which was constantly shifting westward. Even today you can argue with what is happening in Galwan or Gogra or Hot Spring or Depsang. It's, the claim line or the line of actual control seems to be shifting. What it is in the Chinese mind, we don't know. So we take decisions to have this kind of continuous surveillance policy. I think that's what K. Subramaniam called it. I think that's a more accurate definition. A continuous surveillance policy, not with the intention of militarily dislodging the Chinese, but preventing further ingress and also keeping a watch over what they were doing. But the Chinese interpreted it differently, of course, and after a point, we were teetering on the edge of conflict. And that's exactly what happened.
That is fascinating, because so much of it, like you said, even today, this is live. This history is still living with us today. And our interpretations of how the Chinese are interpreting our actions and how they are looking at the world, again, it's something that today is still extremely important from our point of view to be able to, because often what happens is this, and I'm sort of deviating from the book, is that when we look at the policy when we look at the world from our prism, we interpret all actions from the prism of our interests, as opposed to necessarily what's animating that action. And say in the case of others have argued sort of a lot of domestic factors within China at that point in time, the Great Leap Forward and the challenges of that, Mao's own personal sort of situation in power. So there were sort of multiple factors, which again is extremely difficult as a policymaker when you're sort of looking at all of this. Okay, so with that, I want to sort of throw it open to the crowd. I've purposely left out any sort of conversation of present times. So if people would like to ask questions, please raise your hand. We can start with you, sir.
My name is Rahul, general interest in history. So my question is, does China see any value in relationship with India going forward? Do they find something useful, or we are just, a small entity out there and they want to really compete with US, Europe, Russia? So is there any reason for them to be dealing with us? I mean, also rolling it back to,
Well, I think today we're dealing with a China that, in fact, is quite different from the China we dealt with in the 1950s. And while there will be boilerplate statements of, 1,000 years of friendship and how there was really no cause for conflict between the two countries, I mean, this is all stated, I think, in a very sort of stilted way by the Chinese at every formal encounter that we have with them. But then if you read the documentation that comes out from their researchers, from their experts, from their spokesmen, you can sense that China today is playing for very high stakes on the global stage. It equates itself with the United States. One Chinese writer, in fact, Fu Ying, you know her, had written recently that the suit that the US wears today has become too loose for it. It doesn't fit. That's the kind of way, they are looking at the power equation in a manner that they are today very much the equals of the United States, and that they can very easily vie for number one position because they see the US power, quote, unquote, in decline, especially after the financial crisis of a decade ago. So China is jockeying for power, for influence, and I think it's also right what people say, that its own governance system, the so-called efficacy of Communist Party rule, not communism per se, but of China's own governance model, is the best thing for the region. That is much better than democracy, because democracies have their failings, have their shortcomings, which the Chinese don't. The Chinese feel that the concept of original sin doesn't attach to them. It looks like that. So in that scenario, in that calculation, where does India stand? Well, India is a democracy. India is a vibrant democracy that has celebrated diversity and fundamental freedoms since its inception. All that goes against the grain of Chinese belief. So in this clash of ideologies, in this competition with the rest of the world, China slots us somewhere into that, that scheme of things, not as a rival, not as a competitor, although we look on it as a rival, as a competitor. We talk of competitive coexistence with China. Today it's more, armed coexistence, I would say, with China. But the Chinese view of the world is basically to become the number one power today. And as I said, exert power and influence across the region. And where it comes into, a situation of interface with India, especially in our neighborhood, it wants to make sure that it, in a sense, is able to dominate the neighborhood and encircle India, really, in the region.
Can I just add a little bit to that, and then I'll come to you, sir? Towards the end of the book, you talk about the current situation, right? And you make this point that, were those victories of the Chinese real or Pyrrhic in some ways? And you also you're not pessimistic. That's clear. You're not pessimistic, but you're not necessarily even an optimist. So so that just tells me that you're an excellent diplomat. You still sort of make the point that at the end of the day, there is a possibility. And one of the possibilities that you throw out there is actually going back to the past, sort of an approach to not borders, but frontiers. How difficult would that be in the current sort of environment that we are in, where borders are sacrosanct? You have a new border law that the Chinese have come up with, which talks about, the border being inviolable, it being sacred. How difficult is sort of the progress of nation states making something like that as a solution possible? And I think you also sort of dwell upon what is the impact of all of this on the people and their culture and their lives who lived in these borderlands. So a little bit about what is your possibilities in terms of going forward of a resolution for the relationship, and can something like this, a creative solution like this, be even possible given the sort of two-state games that diplomacy is, where two-stage games where you're playing at an international level, but you're also playing at a domestic level. I just wanted to add that to that question.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, I do talk about the concept of frontier zones. I recently gave a talk in Amritsar just a few days ago on borderlands, and this whole concept of borderlands being those zones of interaction, and how people in those areas have perspectives that are quite different from what we are seeking to parlay in national capitals. There is a line in the book where I say that New Delhi, Islamabad, and Beijing like to play ventriloquist. But the people in the border areas, when you look at their concerns, their traditions, the linguistic and cultural boundaries in these areas are very different from the political boundaries. And the story literally cuts across the map. The map is sacred, but the story cuts across the map. And that's what I've tried to tell in my narrative. And this whole thing, I also have in other fora talked about a Himalayan consensus, which it does not exist today. And that Himalayan consensus has to focus on, our shared concerns when it comes to climate change, when it comes to water, when it comes to natural resources, when it comes to old points of trade, contact, cultural osmosis, as I've referred to. You look at the old Tibetan maps, there are no boundary lines, but there are monastic estates, there is a record of vegetation, there is a record of rivers, and that is gone forever. But as I've said often, every map has to have a place called utopia. And I'm not an optimist, I'm neither a pessimist, but I think, dream of better times. They may never come. Yeah. Because, as you said, the Chinese line has become not just the border, but the approach to borders. Somewhere it was said that China is the vicar in the high church of sovereignty today. It is really the high priest. Yeah. Everything to do with sovereignty becomes, inviolable, as many people would say it should be. But what does that make for the prospect of border settlements, of some process of give and take, of adjustment? Political will, yes, that's what's required, but also vision, a great deal of vision and foresight.
Right, thank you. Okay, that's perfect. I think I wanted to end with reading the last sentence of the book and asking a question based on that to wrap everything up. In your sort of conclusion, you write, perhaps one can visualize the dramatis personae in our history, most of them taken away by the Grim Reaper, congregating one last time in some galactic hideaway as they take stock of the enormous liabilities that stem from the gambles they made and the burden this inheritance imposes on future generations yet unborn. Yet India today is very different. India has gotten past the hesitations of history, of colonialism and the sense of weariness with partners and alliances. And we're looking at a new, essentially, and there's a certain parallel, right? We're looking at a new sort of Cold War-esque environment coming up today also. There is a flux in world order, and we don't have the same sort of senses. Would India, if Nehru was in charge today, would he have the same prism of idealism? Or would there be, for the lack of a better word, realism towards alliances, partners, balancing, military capacity? Because that is the way that we are going at present. I wanted to sort of put you in that position where if Nehru was here today, how would he look at events today and what do you think his policy would be?
Well, if Nehru had lived till today, I think he would be much sadder and wiser, hopefully. And also, I believe that the experience of these years, first the pinnacles of friendship and coexistence, culminating in the very tragic war, because of which he felt betrayed and completely broken. Do you think he could have mended after that time? I think Nehru was too much of the idealist and visionary, I think, to have just healed so quickly. I think he would have been he was completely disturbed by what happened with China, and he would have felt completely alienated. I don't believe it would have been easy to mend that relationship. But taking Indira Gandhi, his daughter, she was the one who really pushed the process of normalization with China by sending back our ambassador in 1976. So in a sense, she as the legatee, as it were, of Nehru, took the steps to begin the process of normalization with China. And her son, Rajiv Gandhi, and I'm not for dynastic politics, I have nothing to do with that, but I'm just saying, so it happened that her son, Rajiv Gandhi, as Prime Minister, took that leap of faith to undertake a visit to Beijing in 1988 against opposition from within his own cabinet to sort of meet Deng Xiaoping, meet the Chinese leadership, and to say that we must structure a relationship between India and China that can make an Asian century possible. So in a sense, the wheel came full circle.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rao. Thank you so much for this conversation. And thank you so much for writing this book. I think it is a must-read for people who want to understand how history played out and how it impacts our current dynamics. Thank you so much, everyone.